"Kelly," Lucia called. "Stop!" Kelly, who was careening through the dining room, sobbing and stumbling over endoskeleton parts and human limbs, didn't respond. She didn't slow down either. Not until she tripped over a bar-height chair and fell. She landed full on her front, her arms and legs splayed. Lucia rushed forward, kicking aside a crumpled purple paper tablecloth, and she dropped to her knees next to Kelly's left hip. "Kelly, are you okay?" She looked down at Kelly's still form, at her torn, filthy clothes. Just a few hours before, Kelly's tan crop top and olive capri pants had been pristine. Lucia remembered feeling envious of how good Kelly had looked. Envy. Now that was a hoot. What a wasted emotion. If Lucia had known then, meandering clueless through the bright, shiny carnival with her friends and not friends, what was ahead of her, she would have never wasted a single second of her life on envy. Kelly moaned, rolled over, and sat up. She rubbed a growing knot on her forehead and winced. Lucia frowned at the reddening lump. "Are you dizzy?" Lucia asked. Kelly shook her head. "I don't think so." Using the back of her hand, Kelly wiped her eyes and snuffled. Lucia shifted position and scooted over to sit next to Kelly. I should be crying too, Lucia thought. Jace was dead. Sweet, harmless Jace. Jace, who Lucia had treated like crap. Jace, who had kissed Lucia like she'd never been kissed before, right before he went off to die. The kiss had changed everything. It had thrown Lucia's emotions into total chaos, tossing out the window all that she thought she knew about boys, about what she thought she felt for Adrian, and what she thought she hadn't felt for Jace. It turned out that Lucia had liked Jace a lot more than she thought she did. But now it didn't matter. He was gone. But Lucia didn't have the luxury of trying to sort through the landscape of her heart. She needed to focus for something else entirely. If Jace's death was to mean anything, he'd given his life to trap the mimic. If Lucia and Kelly were going to survive, Lucia needed every bit of her mind to come up with a plan. Lucia used her shoulder to nudge Kelly. Now that the mimic was confined, Lucia said, we have time to look for a way out. We already tried, remember? Kelly mumbled. Lucia snorted. We were running around like a stampeding herd trapped in a pen, she said. We never really tried hard to get through any of the debris blocking the windows and doors. We need to get to the exits. Pick the one that looks like the most accessible and figure out how to get to it. Kelly sniffed and turned around to look at Lucia. Lucia stiffened. Kelly's eyes, though rimmed in red, were dark and steely. She squinted at Lucia and pressed her lips together. She's judging me for not crying, Lucia thought. Kelly, Lucia began. A loud crack echoed through the building. Kelly gasped and started to tremble. Lucia cocked her head and listened. The building was silent for a full minute. Then Lucia heard a clank. A series of softer clinks followed, and after that, a metallic rending sound reached out from a far end of the hall and scored through the dining room like a physical assault. It's the mimic, Kelly whispered. Before Lucia could respond, Kelly was on her feet. Her eyes were wide and her gaze whipping right and left. Kelly's mouth was stretched into a disordered rictus. Kelly whimpered and took off, sprinting toward the archway leading to the pizzeria's lobby. Here we go again, Lucia thought. Right after Jace's final scream had ended, and Lucia and Kelly had held each other in their grief. Kelly had lost her mind and bolted. Now she was doing it again. Lucia scrambled to her feet. Kelly, wait, she shouted. Kelly didn't wait. She kept going. She was back into full-on panic mode. She'd been in she'd been in before she'd fallen flat on her face. Hurtling over an upturned table and dashing around a pile of lumber, Kelly ran as if the mimic was on her heels instead of the far end of the restaurant trapped in the storage room. "Kelly," Lucia tried again. Lucia trotted after her friend. As she did, she listened to the continuing racket coming from the opposite side of the pizzeria. Yes, it was the mimic, but it was confined. It could bash and bang all it wanted. It wasn't getting out. Lucia heard another clank. Her steps faltered. What if the mimic did get out? Lucia shook it off. She followed Kelly's frenzied progress through the lobby and watched when Kelly threw herself at the pile of rubble blocking the pizzeria's main door. Kelly grunted, struggling to shift a concrete slab. She was panting and making little mewing sounds at the back of her throat. She was also muttering under her breath, "Come on, come on, come on." She whispered the words like they were a mantra that would give her strength. Lucia reached Kelly's side, and Kelly looked up. She clenched her teeth and gestured at the concrete with her chin. "Help me move this," she urged. Lucia shook her head. "Kelly, there's no point." Kelly shook her head wildly. Her long brown hair, tangled and stringy with sweat, whipped over her cheeks. She stared through the strands, and the white of her eyes nearly bulging from her face. She kept straining to move the concrete slab. When Lucia didn't make a move to help, Kelly looked up at Lucia and screamed, "Don't just stand there, help me move this, we have to get out of here." A thud resounded in the distance. Lucia felt the muscles in her jaw tighten. She forced herself to relax them. She bent over and put a hand on Kelly's shoulder. Kelly immediately flung away Lucia's hand. "Don't touch me," Kelly yelled. "Just help me move this." Lucia squatted next to Kelly and tried to grab Kelly's grasping hand. Kelly was clawing at the concrete. Her nails were tearing. Blood was running from her fingertips. She still wrestled with the heavy slab. Lucia reached out and grabbed Kelly's wrist. Kelly tried to shake Lucia off. Lucia held on. The two grappled for several seconds. Kelly finally managed to get one hand free. She reared back and slapped Lucia across the face. One of her broken nails gouged in Lucia's cheek. Lucia didn't think. She just reacted. She slapped Kelly back. Hard. "Stop it," Lucia screamed. Kelly continued to thrash. Lucia reached past Kelly's swinging arms and grabbed her shoulders. "Kelly," she shouted, "listen to me. Just listen for a second." When Kelly kept fighting, Lucia shook her. Kelly finally went limp. Her breath came in long and ragged heaves. Lucia let go of Kelly and stepped back. "We can't get out this way, Kelly," she said quietly. Kelly didn't respond. "Even if we moved all these concrete chunks," Lucia continued, "the door is blocked on the other side by a mountain of poured concrete, remember? We saw it before we broke in here." Kelly's head dropped forward. She swayed on her feet but stayed upright. She stared at the floor. Lucia started to put an arm around Kelly's shoulder. She wanted to reassure her that they would find a way out, just not this way. The next sound she heard, though, had her choking on the words she'd been intending to use. The sound wasn't as loud as the other sounds they heard. It was just a clatter and a scrape. But the volume of the sound wasn't the issue. It's the location. The sound wasn't coming from the storage room. It was coming from someplace a little closer than that. The mimic was no longer contained. After the mimic had been dismantled, the unit that had been in the little tunnel, it had turned and assessed its surroundings. Its visual and auditory processors had been registered one small enclosed room, one door, 17 boxes, 5 opened and 12 unopened, 18 toys, 11 plush animals, and 7 dolls. One of the dolls stared at the mimic. The mimic determined that the doll should have handled the way it had learned to handle all endoskeleton-like objects. Such objects had a head, a torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs. The mimic was programmed to break off the limbs and heads. The mimic had leaned over, picked up the pigtailed doll, and ripped its head from its body. It then tore off arms and legs, dropping the parts in a pile near one wall of a small room. The mimic had turned and studied the room's door. The mimic knew how to open the door, so it had walked over and grasped the door's handle. It turned the handle, but the door wouldn't open. It exerted more force. Wood cracked and the handle came free of the door. The mimic looked at it and tossed the handle onto a pile of doll parts. The mimic had reached into the hole the handle had left behind. It pulled the door. Now the mimic faced a solid expanse of metal, a tabletop that blocked the doorway. It had no established protocol for getting through a solid wall, so it turned away from the metal. The mimic was not designed to be confined in a room, so it had assessed what it learned about exiting rooms. It immediately recalled watching the boy unit squirm into the little tunnel, which was the other way out of the room. The mimic would copy the boy unit and go out of the way of the room. The mimic had pushed aside a stack of boxes to gain access to the entrance of the small tunnel. It bent over. The tunnel was small. Its head fit through the opening, but its shoulders didn't. This wasn't a problem. The mimic simply needed to take a different form. It was programmed to do this. It could take any form necessary to fulfill its functioning. So the mimic had reconfigured itself and then crawled into the tunnel. The tunnel was rectangular in shape, and it was made of metal. It slanted upward. The mimic's metal limbs scraped against the side of the tunnel's metal as it climbed to the top of the narrow enclosure. Its auditory processors registered a long grinding sound as it moved. It had used the sharp tips of its fingers to pierce the metal so it wouldn't slide backward down the tunnel, stabbing the metal pin to gain purchase, then compressing and contracting its limbs to fit within a confined space. The mimic was able to heft itself to the top of the tunnel slope and launch itself into the next section of the vent. Lucia didn't hesitate. She grabbed Kelly's hand. "Come on, Kelly," Lucia urged. "We need to go." Lucia started to pull Kelly back toward the archway, but Kelly resisted. "Where are you going? We have to get out." Lucia gritted her teeth and listened to the series of metal-on-metal scratches. The scratches sounded like they were coming from all over the building, as if huge insects were crawling through the walls and floors. No, not the walls and floors, the ducts. The mimic somehow made it into the ductwork. So much for the idea of it being too heavy for the metal passageways. Lucia gripped Kelly's hand harder. "I know we need to get out," Lucia said, "but I told you we can't get out this way. And whichever way we try to get out, it's not going to be fast enough. It won't take the mimic long to find a vent cover and get out of the ductwork. I have an idea that should buy us some time, but we need to go. Now." Kelly blinked and then nodded. Lucia exhaled and relieved. She squeezed Kelly's hand and began leading her back into the dining room. It didn't matter how many times Lucia crossed through this shamble of broken tables and chairs, chaotic piles of construction material, and mounds of metal and human body parts. Lucia's skin crawled every time. The room wasn't much of a room as it was a tomb, a chaotic explosion of death and decay. Lucia kicked aside a few party favors as she aimed for one of the tangled piles and endoskeleton parts. Reaching the mound of metal, she let go of Kelly's hand. She bent over and extracted 2 endoskeleton arms. She hefted them, studied them, and nodded. "These should work," she said. Kelly frowned, but didn't ask any questions. Her gaze was glassy and unfocused. Lucia was pretty sure Kelly was in shock. Tucking in the endoskeleton arms under her left arm, Lucia took Kelly's hand again. She led Kelly toward the far edge of the stage at the back of the dining room. She heard Kelly's foot kick a paper cup. The cup was skittered across the black and white floor tiles and spun in a circle at the base of the stage. "Where are we going?" Kelly asked. A gut-clenching thrum and thunderous rattle coursed through the pizzeria. These were followed by a sonorous clang. "I'll tell you in a minute," Lucia said. "We need to hurry. I'm pretty sure the mimics got out of the ductwork now." Kelly began to breathe faster. Her audible puffs kept time with the patter of their footsteps as Lucia led Kelly up onto stage and back through the heavy red curtain. Once Lucia let the thick velvet fabric drop behind them, she quickly surveyed the dim backstage area. The small room near the back was the best place, she decided. It was what they had needed. It was close to one of the pizzeria's back exits. Lucia urged Kelly forward. "This is what we're going to do," Lucia said. She gently pushed back ahead of her into the small room, and she and the others had found behind the hidden door when they'd gone in search of what they thought were other people trapped in the building. It hadn't been people waiting in the little room. It had been the mimic, and they had to run away from the room quickly. Before they had, though, Lucia had seen that the room was filled with costumes. Lucia heard another clatter. It was closer than the last one. The shearing screeches of metal on metal had stopped. The mimic was for sure out of the ducts now. Lucia wished she knew where it had come out. Not that it mattered. Wherever it was, Lucia and Kelly didn't have much time. Lucia had two endoskeletons' arms on the floor, leaning them against the door jamb. Then she rushed over to a fox fur costume that looked like a blue-spotted dog. She eyed it and Kelly. She nodded. Snatching up the costume, she held it out to Kelly. "You need to get into this costume," Lucia said. Kelly's face screwed up in disgust. "What? Why?" She backed away from the rag torn and matted fur. Lucia didn't blame Kelly for her reaction. These costumes were mildly and moth-eaten. Who knew what bugs lurked within them? But being bitten by bugs was better than being dismembered. Lucia held onto the blue dog costume as she scanned the other costumes. She spied on a bright court jester costume. The costume was the only one in the room that wasn't made of fox fur, and it looked cleaner than the rest of them. Lucia stepped up to the costume, suppressing a shiver at the jester's leering, toothy grin and its wide eyes. In contrast to the jester's mechanical grin, its colors were cheerful and vivid. Its face and its jester hat were half raspberry pink and half greenish yellow. Lucia reached for the silky material, opened up the suit, and started to put her arm inside of it. As soon as Lucia's hand slipped into the jester costume sleeve, she recoiled and snatched her hand back. She stumbled away from the costume, her breath spurting in agitated gasps. "What is it?" Kelly asked. Her tone was edgy and pitched upward. She was poised to run. Lucia shook off her alarm and turned away from the court gesture. "It's okay. I just almost got into a spring lock suit is all." "A spring lock suit?" Lucia looked around at the other costumes. She started toward a grayish rodent costume. A rat? A mouse? It didn't matter. Lucia grabbed the rodent costume and turned toward Kelly. "I read about the spring-lock suits in one of the manuals I found in the office," Lucia said. "They have metal clamps that are designed to lock on to the wearer, but their design was faulty. The clamps were lethal. They can literally crush the wearer." Kelly looked at the other two costumes Lucia held. Her brows bunched together. "These two are okay," Lucia said. "I don't get why we need to get in costumes at all," Kelly said. "We're getting into costumes," Lucia explained, "because I think once we're in costume, we'll blend into their surroundings here. Obviously, the mimic, for whatever reason, is following some protocol to dismember humans. It clearly doesn't destroy these characters, though, because they're all intact. If we look like just another Fazbear Entertainment character, it should leave us alone." Kelly frowned and stared at the costumes. She chewed on her lower lip. Lucia once again pressed the dog costume toward Kelly. This time, Kelly, with obvious reluctance, took the costume. Lucia began slipping into the rodent costume. Her lip curled involuntarily. The costume reeked. It wasn't just mildewy. It stank of sweat, and it smelled gamey and rancid, like it was putrefied carcass of an actual rodent as opposed to a costume. Kelly began struggling to get into the dog costume. "Ew," she complained. "It stinks." "Yeah," Lucia said. "It didn't bother her to the point out that stink can't kill you, whereas being found by the mimic definitely would." The rodent costume was stiff. Lucia had to bunch up her skirt to get her legs into the costume, and the costume's interior abraded her bare legs. She could tell that from the crackling sound of Kelly's costume that it was as rigid as Lucia's was. Kelly didn't complain anymore, though. She just wormed her way into the blue dog costume and zipped up the front of its torso. She held the dog's head in her hands. Her face was dirty, pale, tear-streaked, and taut. She looked at Lucia. Are you sure this is going to work?" Kelly asked. Lucia zipped herself into the rodent costume. She grasped the big-eared, broken-whiskered head. "It should. But for it to work, we're going to have to be perfectly still when the mimic is close by." Lucia canted her head and listened. She didn't hear anything. The pizzeria was silent except for Kelly's continued agitated breathing of the pounding in Lucia's ears. The pounding, she realized, was beating of her heart. She might have been pretending to be calm, but her body knew how she really felt. The rapid drumming of her rapid-fire heartbeat was like a demented drum circle drumming a louder and louder beat through her whole body. Lucia ignored the internal claymore. "Here's what we'll do," she said. She tucked in the rodent under her arm and gestured for Kelly to do the same with the blue dog head. "We're going to see if we can uncover the exit door at the rear end of the backstage area. I noticed we were all trying to get out." Lucia stopped. She suddenly inundated by the reality of what they'd been through. Just a few hours before, all 8 of them had been looking for a way out of the building. Now she and Kelly were the only ones left. Lucia worked her mouth to summon up enough saliva to swallow. She shook off the gag and tried to well up her esophagus. She cleared her throat and tried again. When we all trying to get out, I noticed the concrete slabs over the back door here had crumbled more than the slabs over the ones by the other windows and doors. They're in smaller chunks. I think we might be able to use these endoskeleton arms to lever the chunks away from the door. Maybe. Lucia shrugged. What else is there to say? They had to do something. Or just give up and die. Lucia wasn't ready for that. Lucia motioned for Kelly to follow her. They stepped toward the doorway. Lucia picked up the 2 endoskeleton arms, and she and Kelly left the small room. Pausing outside the room, Lucia listened again. Nothing. The mimic was obviously out of the ductwork, but it wasn't close. She didn't hear the familiar tap hiss rasp that it made when it walked. She squinted at the gap between the stage curtains. Between them, the dining room lights were still glowing. The mimic wasn't close. Not yet. "Follow me," Lucia said. Lucia quickly wove her way through several freestanding racks stuffed with more costumes. Avoiding the open wardrobe where Nick's remains lay, Lucia hurried past a leaning stack of boxes that led Kelly to the backstage's exterior door. Its neon exit sign was sputtering weakly, providing anemic hope for Lucia's and Kelly's escape. Putting her back to the potential exit, Lucia looked toward a certain gap again. The dining room lights still shone through it. The pizzeria was still silent. Lucia nudged Kelly, who gasped and startled. Then she let out a humorous chuckle. "Sorry," she said. "Yeah, because you have no reason to be jumpy," Lucia said. The sarcasm made Kelly chuckle for real. Lucia grinned at her. "Okay," Lucia said. "We aren't going to be able to work wearing the costume heads, but we need to keep them close." Lucia bent over and she set her rodent head next to the rubble blocking the door. Kelly followed suit with the blue dog head. Lucia handed Kelly an endoskeleton arm. "Let's start with these chunks here." Lucia squatted in front of the 2 and cracked the deteriorating slabs. She shoved the hand end of the endoskeleton arm between the slabs. Cement dust wafted upward. Lucia's nose twitched. She muzzled a sneeze. Lucia pointed to another clump of concrete. "You work on that one. We'll have to listen, though." Kelly rolled her eyes. As if I'd forget to do that," she muttered. Lucia's lips quirked. And there was Kelly. She had gotten to know over the previous few hours. Maybe Kelly's shock wasn't abating a little. Lucia stopped prying at the concrete. She listened. She heard nothing. She returned to jimmying the concrete away from the slab next to it. Kelly began poking at a narrow space under her concrete slab. Concrete and cement are often used interchangeably, Lucia said softly as she worked. But actually, cement is just an ingredient in concrete. Concrete is a mix of aggregates, meaning sand and gravel or maybe crushed stone and paste. The paste is water and cement. Kelly gave Lucia a who cares look, but Lucia ignored it. Lucia knew she didn't give a darn about the makeup of concrete, but talking about something mundane would help Kelly, and Lucia calmed down. Concrete usually hardens over time, but cracks like these, Lucia gestured at the concrete they were attempting to work free, can be caused by a number of conditions. Because concrete is porous, it absorbs water. When the water in the concrete freezes, it separates the cement binder from the aggregate and causes crumbling. I know, Kelly said. She stopped straining over the block and tilted her head to listen. Lucia stopped too. When she heard nothing, she shifted the endoskeleton arm, trying to get better leverage. The concrete was shifting a little. Maybe in an hour or so, she'd be able to move one of the slabs away from the door. Lucia suppressed a sigh. Trying to get out of this door was pointless. Really. The only reason she was doing this because she didn't have a better plan yet. Doing nothing, even doing nothing and hiding, was a prescription for a full-on meltdown. And meltdowns weren't conducive to coming up with ideas. Staying busy was essential to keeping it together. Kelly grunted as she attempted to move her slab again. Another one cause of cracking comes with adjurate itself, she said. The minerals in the gravel leach out and start crumbling. Lucia raised an eyebrow at Kelly, who glanced over and saw Lucia's expression. "What?" Kelly said. "I can read, too." Lucia laughed. Her heart rate slowed. The din in her head quieted a little. But then Lucia turned and looked toward the slit between the stage curtains. The narrow opening. She saw the dining room lights flicker. "Put the costume head on," Lucia hissed as she set down the endoskeleton arm as quietly as possible. She grabbed the rodent head of her costume. Kelly didn't hesitate. Lucia copied Lucia's movements instantly. Together, they donned their costume heads. They both had speedily tucked their hair upside the heads. Lucia's frizzy black hair made the costume head a tight fit. Costume heads in place, Kelly and Lucia straightened and scurried over to stand in the midst of the other costumes. Then they froze. Just as the gap between the stage curtains went black, the mimic was close. Lucia breathed as slowly and evenly through her mouth as possible, which wasn't that slow. Her heart rate had ratcheted back into overdrive again. Her body wanted to pant. It would have been easier to breathe quietly through her nose, but she couldn't do that. The interior of the rodent head stank even more than the rest of the costume. The stench was nauseating, so much so that her stomach had roiled in protest the second she had pulled on the costume head. Standing just a foot from Lucia, Kelly was clearly struggling to be quiet. She was doing pretty well, though. Lucia could only hear inhales every second or so. Lucia couldn't see Kelly. They were standing side by side, and Lucia couldn't risk turning her head even a tiny bit. Just beyond the stage curtains, the tap hiss rasp started coming their way. Through the mesh of the rodent's eye holes, Lucia saw the stage curtain flutter, then it swayed. Then the backstage lights went out. Total blackness. Robbed of her vision, Lucia's other senses went into turbocharged. The pungent odor inside of the rodent head got stronger. The surface of the suit's fabric got rougher. The mimic's approaching footsteps got louder. Every tap radiated around the inside of Lucia's head. Every hiss was drawn out like the angry warning of a snake about to strike. Every rasp felt like it was exaggerating Lucia's inner ears. Behind the sound of the mimic's approach, Lucia's breathing and that of Kelly's of her sounded like deafening wind gusts. Surely the mimic would hear them. Even so, they had to stay still. Running at this point would mean death. Lucia was tempted to count the passing seconds, but she refrained. She didn't have the time to know it was passing. Her muscles, protesting her like a statue-like position, were doing a fine job of letting her know how long she and Kelly had been frozen in place. Lucia's knees were beginning to quaver. Her lower back started to ache. The balls of her feet began to burn, forcing herself to ignore the sounds of the mimic's footsteps. Lucia put all of her attention on relaxing muscles as much as possible. Then she began doing the math equations in her head. That was a trick her dad taught her when she was little. When Lucia couldn't go to sleep at night, Lucia's mom had told her to think of something nice. Imagine being at a picnic or going to the beach, Lucia's mom said. Lucia tried that. It didn't work. Whenever she thought about anything, her mind would take off. One thought was the first domino in succession about a thought of dominoes. The beach would lead to the sea, which led to boats, which led to fishing, which led to dolphins, which led to dolphins getting caught in nets, etc. But then Lucia would be even more wide awake. Her dad told Lucia that the problem was the emotions connected to the thoughts. The trick is math equations, he said. Math is emotionless. Just play with the numbers. It will calm your mind. So now, Lucia played with the numbers for a very long time. Somewhere in the middle of her 12th complex equation, Lucia noticed that she wasn't hearing anything. She turned her attention to her senses, and she realized the lights were back on. It had worked. The mimic was gone. Just in case, though, Lucia counted to 60 before she moved. At 60, the lights were still on. The backstage area? No. The entire pizzeria was silent. Lucia turned her head slowly to look at Kelly. She could see Kelly's wide eyes staring back at her through the mesh of the blue dog's costume eyes. Lucia turned again to look around. Everything was the same as it had been before, or at least she thought it was. The backstage area was such a jumble of boxes and costumes, it was hard to remember what was there. But it looked okay to Lucia. She started to raise a hand to remove the rodent head. Thankfully, she only raised her hand an inch or so before she saw it. She froze. She stared hard at the costumes near the wardrobe. Lucia had never looked too closely at the costumes in the wardrobe area because of Nick. But she had registered the colors of the costumes without even realizing that she had. She'd seen black, brown, blonde, dirty white, yellow, and pink. However, she was seeing a brighter pink, an almost reddish pink. Cerise, Lucia thought inanely. She would have noticed a cerise costume that had been there before, especially the pinkish color that was coming from the creepy mushroom hat. The cerise and white spotted mushroom cap was atop a gaping-eyed mushroom stem, wearing the overalls that matched the cerise cap. The mushroom character's face had an eerie, yawning black hole of a mouth. Lucia surely would have noticed if it had been there before. Lucia caught her breath and held it. She tried to talk to herself out of what she was seeing, but she couldn't do it. There was definitely a new costume by the wardrobe, and there could have only been one reason for that. Lucia didn't dare move or make a sound to warn Kelly. All she could do was will Kelly to remain still and hope Kelly was taking Lucia's cue. She hoped Kelly had gotten to know Lucia well enough to reason that if Lucia wasn't moving, she had a reason for staying still. A full minute passed, and another. Kelly did indeed remain frozen. She didn't make a sound until the creepy mushroom moved. When the mushroom's head turned, Lucia heard Kelly gasp. Every muscle in Lucia's body contracted. She held her breath. The gasp had been a quiet one. Hopefully the mimic hadn't heard it. Lucia stared at the mushroom. Was it coming this way? The mushroom rotated. Its dark, round eyes inspected the whole backstage area. When the mushroom's gaze fell on Lucia, she closed her own eyes. A couple seconds later, Lucia opened her eyes, just in time to see the stage lights start to flicker. The mushroom was now walking toward them, and the lights went out. Half a second later, the lights came back on. They came back on just in time for Lucia to see something crawling out of the back of the mushroom costume. It took all Lucia's willpower not to scream at the top of her lungs. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. When Hope, just minutes before she had died, described the mimic, she described it as this big, shiny, black metal skeleton. Before Lucia had found the user's manual that told her the thing that killed Hope was a robot called a mimic. She and the others had thought of the thing as a creature, but it had been an upright, vaguely man-shaped creature. The drawings Lucia had seen in the manual had depicted an upright creature as well. This user's manual, however, had said the mimic could take many forms. Apparently, this was one of its forms. Creeping out the back of the overalls-clad mushroom was an abomination of twisted and contorted metal. The abomination was a mass of metal joints and wires that were shaped into something vaguely resembling a mutated spider, with one of its eyes on one leg and the other on its back. The frightening spider had 9 legs, instead of spider's usual 8. One of the legs extended from its mouth where it should have been. That leg pulsed through the air like a proboscis seeking something to suck the scuttling creature's bowels. Unlike the mimic's footballs, when it was upright, the configuration of the mimic's parts made a tsk sound. A sloppy ticking that was at the same time squealing, wet and dryly brittle. The sound was much, much worse than the tap, hiss, rasp. That sound made every hair on Lucia's body stand on end. It nearly drove her instantaneously mad. Kelly must have felt the same way. She suddenly made a run for it. Lucia opened her mouth to shout no, but self-preservation stopped the word from coming out. The thing scooting across the floor might have looked like an alien insect, but it was the mimic. And the mimic could hear if Lucia shouted, she'd give herself away. She didn't move a muscle. But then Lucia's concern for Kelly overrode thoughts of Lucia's own safety. She couldn't help herself. "Kelly, stop!" Lucia screamed. Lucia immediately sucked in her breath. She'd given herself away, but it was worth it. Kelly stopped. Halfway to the stage curtain, she froze, turning into a furry blue dog statue. Lucia, staring hard at Kelly, could see that the blue dog's tail quivered a little, but otherwise it was motionless. "Way to go, Kelly," Lucia thought. Lucia, moving her eyes only, followed the mimic's progress as it squirmed across the wood floor. Its metal appendages continue to make that tsk. The floor vibrated under the mimic's weight. For a second, Lucia thought the mimic was coming for her. It was moving directly towards her, but the mimic didn't approach the stock-still rodent. It kept going on past. It scrabbled over toward the blue dog costume. Lucia stiffened. The mimic circled the blue dog. Its proboscis-like extension searched the air around the blue dog costume as if it was trying to sniff out the costume's authenticity. Twice, the mimic backed away from the blue dog. Each time, it scooted forward again. It used one appendage to tentatively tap the blue dog's foot. "Don't move, Kelly," Lucia thought. Somehow, Kelly was holding it together. She didn't move. The mimic was acting like it was studying the blue dog, as if it was confused by it. Lucia understood the mimic's reaction. It probably was registering the fact that the dog hadn't been there when the mimic had first come backstage. How did the mimic reason? Lucia wondered. Would it figure out the ruse? The mimic backed away from the blue dog costume again. It turned and started around the stage curtain. A near silent sigh of relief escaped from between Lucia's lips. It was going to be okay. But then, it wasn't. Suddenly, the mimic turned again. It scurried back toward the blue dog. What happened next happened so fast that Lucia's brain was barely able to process it, and she didn't want to process it. In a nanosecond, one of the mimic's spidery legs reached out and peeled open the back of the blue dog costume. The instant the costume was breached, the mimic wormed its way past the edges of the matte and blue fur. Inconceivably, shockingly, the mimic shoved itself inside the costume with Kelly. Lucia heard a sickening crunch. Kelly, Lucia thought. She hadn't even finished thinking Kelly's name before Kelly screamed. The scream speared through Lucia like a lance. It plunged so deeply into Lucia's heart that pain felt like real, physical pain. Red hot, piercing. But the scream wasn't the worst of it. The crunch was followed by another snap, then another. Kelly's screams went an octave higher. The snapping was joined by splintering sounds, spongy, wet, slippering sounds. The costume's blue fur started going dark. The darkness began at the costume center mass, and it spread outward quickly, too quickly. Lucia heard another crunch. Kelly stopped screaming. Lucia wanted to close her eyes and pretend to be someplace else, but that didn't feel right. She couldn't do anything for Kelly now, except be a silent witness to Kelly's death. So Lucia didn't close her eyes, but she watched as lumps and bulges writhed under the blood-saturated blue fur. She watched until the blue dog costume began to collapse, folding in on itself, crumpling toward the stage. She continued to watch when the lumpy pile of bloody fur convulsed and then went still. And she watched the blood-soaked blue dog costume once again took form, unfolding itself from the stage to stand upright. She continued to watch the blue dog walk off to the right, out of Lucia's line of sight. When the mimic was no longer in view, Lucia couldn't bring herself to look away from the blood pool, spreading ever wider on the wooden floorboards.